part of that would be, have you looked at other ordinances that other municipalities may have, and or are you aware if this is a common type ordinance for municipalities and counties?
Okay, so to your first question, this pretty much replicates the ordinance from the City of Columbia.
Okay.
Okay, so this was a situation where we thought that unless the council felt like there needed to be any material, substantial changes to it, that we wouldn't necessarily reinvent the wheel. We would utilize something that at least was being utilized locally, and at least right out the box, just give you all something to think about and to address.
Sure.
And what was your second question? I'm sorry.
Well, I think you answered it. I was curious, to know if you looked at other ordinances and or if you were aware if ordinances of this type were common in other counties and municipalities.
I don't know, Ms. Newton, how common they are. I would say that may be dependent on, how much of an issue counties and municipalities are having with holding the owners of rental property accountable for their units. And I think that this is a tool to try to address perhaps issues that counties and municipalities have had with folk who, purchase property, and some of them are not local here. They live in other places, and those properties are not very well maintained. And then the communities and neighborhoods that they're in become run down, or the homes around them lose value because the landlord or the property owner is not keeping up with their property. So I think it varies, and I'm not sure to what degree and or extent it is being utilized, but I know it is being utilized in some places to address those kinds of issues.
Sure. Thank you. And that's a real issue in my area, which was part of the impetus of the motion, where we're finding that people are not necessarily following our ordinances, and you're having a lot of issues with blight, with garbage, with other things. And so exactly to that point. And then my next question would be to administration. So Mr. Smith has already identified that enacting this ordinance would require personnel and a process on the administrative side. So my question specifically to administration is there any additional information that you would like to share on this? And can you talk to any concerns that you might have or resources that you might need on the administration side to support this? For example, there's a fee provided for business licensing. Is that the kind of fee that's going to, in fact, cover the process that is outlined here? So any feedback from administration would be appreciated. Thank you.
Ms. Newton, I have Mike Zapp on the line, who actually oversees building. And I think that when we talk about how this is enforced, it would be prudent to hear from him. So I'll let him start off and then I'll add in.
Good afternoon. Like she said, I'm Mike Zapp. In reference to when you talk personnel and adding additional resources, currently we have the property maintenance team. They're a staff of 4 inspectors, 1 administrative assistant, and a supervisor. Without knowing the total number of rental properties we're talking and what areas they're in, to get it off let's just get it off the block and moving. We can start out with probably the staff we have to facilitate the startup, And then based on the number of rental properties that begin to pop up, or we get better research on what we actually have in the county by sections, because inspectors are broken down by sections. Then from there, we can make an honest adjustment to do this, to have them part of the policing of this new ordinance. However, when you, in the ordinance itself, depending on, what we actually gonna entail, the fee, what's required, there's an inspection to initially get the permit. Are we gonna do an annual, relook at the property, and does that create another inspection? That's when you start talking the volume that has to be addressed. So in turn, there's going to be more personnel needed to enforce this ordinance correctly. Again, I've reached out to the city of Columbia to see exactly how they do it or how they enforce it. It does fall underneath their code enforcement team, which falls under their police department. And they currently have 12 inspectors over in that department. So in turn, we would have to increase some once we get going. So that would be the initial, to kick it off with how we address it. We'd probably just start with what we have and then see how we can break that down by, like Ms. Myers said, by the districts and who has most, and start facilitating more people to handle that load.
And Ms. Newton, I'll add in that when we initially reviewed this draft ordinance, we had some questions, like Mike said, around the practical application of the enforcement, specifically in items I and K through M under the rental permit required section, and what that was going to require in terms of workload. The last numbers I looked at indicate, I believe they're from 2018, and it said something around 51.8% of property in the county is owner occupied. So I would assume that means we're somewhere around 40% rental units, which would be a large influx of work for those four inspectors that Mike talked about. Obviously, there's an opportunity to partner with the sheriff's department to do some of this, and we'll discuss that with Chief Cowan. But we've also assessed that there would be additional resources needed in terms of software and tracking to facilitate some of the language that appears in items K through M in that section that I noted.
Thank you. And I don't, I'm not asking this question to cut conversation off. I just want to understand, from your perspective with the information that you have pending, do you feel like you need to get that additional data before we're able to make an ordinance that's as specific or operational as we would want to move forward with to council?
I would say certainly it would be prudent for us to do some additional research to hopefully engage with the city of Columbia in further conversations about how they're administering such an ordinance, and to do some additional deep diving into more up-to-date numbers around ownership and rental units in the county to see if the current staff we have would be able to substantiate the workload this ordinance would require. I would hate for us to create a situation where we roll something out and then don't have the capacity to enforce it. So I do think that would be the most prudent course of action. Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Teresha.
Thank you, Ms. Chair.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, sorry.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Dickerson.
Yes, this is Ms. Newton, and I know this is very dear to our hearts. My area is really a lot of the area, as you all know. I'm going to specifically, talk about the Broad River Road corridor. It is really in very bad shape, and we are having a very difficult time with this particular problem. So I would suggest that you all, since you're talking about staff, that you probably get a temporary staff to get it under control and then go back to the regular staff. Or maybe you need to look at increasing the staff until we can, actually get this somewhat under control so it can be managed by the regular staff that we have now, because it is getting out of hand. Every day that we will let this go, I'm telling you, it gets worse and worse. And I'm getting calls, I'm getting inundated with calls every day between me and the ombudsman's office with this problem. It is it is contributing to all of the blight, for the most part, that we are having in these areas. And so whatever you all need to do to get additional staff, because we hear this all the time, and we've been going through this problem a long time. So if staff is the issue, then somebody needs to look at a way or find a way how we can get the staff to take care of this problem, because it has to be resolved. Otherwise, we're gonna look like a garbage can. Thank you very much for taking my little quirk, okay?
Thank you, Ms. Dickerson. It sounds like we're already spending a significant amount of staff time dealing with some of this. So thank you.
Okay.
I see Mr. Malinowski's hand is up. I also have Mr. Manning. So can we go Manning and then Malinowski?
Fine with me.
Thank you, Mr. Manning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since there's going to be a fee associated with this, I think that we need to figure out what the need's going to be in the way of staffing, and that should all be calculated into the fee. I don't think that the general fund ought to find a way to up personnel to do something that is regulating something that there's a fee to regulate. The fee should cover all the costs of operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. Mr. Malinowski?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, Mr. Manning just spoke on some of what I was going to comment on. I agree with him. And also, I had, since there's going to be financial implications, I think we need to find out what those will be, as Ms. Powell and Mike were talking about. I understand that there is the problem, as Ms. Dickerson states, do not we have some type of a blight ordinance out there right now? If staff can answer that, that's supposed to be addressed. Well, while we're waiting for them to find out the answer to that, I can continue.
Mr. Malinowski, I don't know that we have a specific blight ordinance. I do think we have a nuisance ordinance, which may be applicable in some situations.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So I'm saying at this point, we do have an ordinance that if something is really, really out of hand, it can be addressed without this particular ordinance being in effect, because we do have something that can handle it, as you're saying, Mr. Smith. Also, go ahead.
Well, let me just be clear. We have a general nuisance ordinance. So it's, you can have certain conditions, on your property that present a nuisance, but we don't have a ordinance that is specific to rental property, which I think this particular ordinance is designed and intended to address.
Understood, but I think that if there is such a terrible nuisance, whether it's a rental property or not, wouldn't it be covered initially? And I guess you'd have that depends on the condition of the property and exactly what's going on with that property at the time. Okay. So you could have a condition on the property. That condition could be visible, and that could constitute a nuisance. But there are some things and conditions on the property that are not visible, which would require inspection. I understand that. Now, also, are there going to be any opportunities? Are we going to open this up for any stakeholder input from the the business community or the builders community or anyone like that? Or is this something we're just going to do, and when it's done, it's done?
Mr. Malinowski.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think this would get its regular public hearing for sure. Are you talking about above and beyond that?
I meant prior to getting to that point while creating the ordinance. So when we get to the 3 readings and the public hearing part, we pretty much have it narrowed down to what we feel it should be. Also, since it's called an absentee landlord ordinance, is this strictly for livable quarters or any type of rental property to include business property?
Mr. Malinowski, did you get the packet? Did you get the memorandum in your packet?
Yeah, I've got it. And I'm just looking because it says the reference is absentee landlord ordinance.
Mr. Malinowski, I think that the ordinance is intended to address residential property, and I think you made a reference to maybe business property. It's not intended to address business property at all. It's intended to address occupied residential type property.
Okay, thank you. And I thought it was, and I think maybe in our heading then we need to have that stipulated in there where it would be absentee residential landlord ordinance. And while I've got several other questions that are throughout this rough draft ordinance you presented to us, I think those questions probably need to wait or be presented to you. Is that correct? Rather than put them out there now?
Were you referring to me, Mr. Malinowski?
Well, to anybody, I guess to the chair, Mr. Acia, are we trying to get all questions answered today, or is this something we're going to come back with after questions are posed to legal and to staff? I kind of think that I thought we were waiting based on how Mr. Manning even said was that we need to figure out where we're going with any type of a fee. Even as Mike Zapp said, we have no idea what manpower is needed. I mean, seems like any financial implications and manpower implications need to be looked at before we just enact an ordinance.
Yes, Mr. Malinowski, we did have statement from staff that it would be prudent to have additional data. So I would imagine that we will get another chance to ask questions about this ordinance here in this committee. I do see that Ms. Newton has her hand up now. Ms. Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Chair, I'm sorry. I was listening to Mr. Malinowski's question, and I will say, based on the things that I heard today, once we had our discussion, I was going to make a motion that we hold this in committee to get answers to some of the questions so that we make sure that when we send it to council, we can have it as thorough as possible. My question, and if it's addressed in here, I missed it. You know, part of the intent of this ordinance, as Mr. Smith said, was where you have these cases where people are repeat violators and offenders in terms of our nuisance codes, but they don't care because they don't own the property, so they just ignore it. And so we have this draft so that we can bring the landlords into this because they would hopefully have some skin in the game. My question for you, Mr. Smith, is as you envision this ordinance, let's say hypothetically, Joe Smith is a renter in a property and you know, they've got the uncovered cars in their yards, the tires, the whatever, they're violating our ordinances. In this case, does that mean that the renter would not get a citation like they do now? Or would those processes operate in tandem where the renter gets a citation and also if it's not addressed, then the business owner gets the citation? Thank you.
You mean the property owner?
Yes, thank you, the property owner.
Yeah, okay. I think ultimately the permit is going to be issued to the owner of the property. So the property owner is ultimately going to be responsible. Now, having said that, the way that the city of Columbia has their ordinance set up, apparently there is a point system. And again, the city's point system is a 15-point system, so that each violation accumulates a certain number of points or has a point value. And once you get the 15 points, at least in the city's model, then you're subject to getting your permit to continue to lease that property revoked. So at that point, if that occurs, since we would have an ordinance that requires a permit in order for you to lease, the owner of that property would no longer be able to lease to the tenant. So in effect, they would be enjoined from continuing to lease that property at that point without a permit.
Thank you.
Mr. Ratio, Madam Chair?
Yes, Ms.
I'll be
Dickerson.
real brief. And I noticed, one of the things that I noticed in this draft is about landlords in terms of residential. Mine includes a lot of also business properties, because a lot of mine are visible along the corridor. And so, you know, most of those businesses along this corridor are leased or rental properties. And so I don't know how you can work it, but I need that to somehow be included somewhere in this particular ordinance, because they are absentee as well. Thank you very much for taking my concern.
Thank you, Ms. Dickerson. I see Mr. Malinowski has his hand up again. Mr. Malinowski.
Yes, Madam Chair, real quickly, two things in reading through the definition section where, and maybe it's because this came from the city, but where it talks about that a responsible local representative means someone within the 45 miles of the rental property. I think we really need to look at that, because going from the far northwest to the far southeast, we may be out of the 45-mile range right there. So you may not even be able to live within the county and own property at the other end of the county. That's number one. Number two, a definition of person means it starts out by saying any natural individual. I'd like that explained, because I don't know what an unnatural individual is. Thank you.
Mr. Smith, is that a legal term that you would like to define for us? Do we still have Mr. Smith?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I was muted. I just think that it just means a person, a human being. I think it doesn't mean any more than that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Newton has her hand up. Ms. Newton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that, or I don't know if it requires a motion. I request that we hold this item in committee and direct staff to come back to us with answers to the questions that we've discussed. And I'd also like for us to direct our clerk to council to send a request to full council asking if they have any additional questions or comments about this ordinance, so that hopefully when this comes back before us, we can address all of those items and be ready to send it to full council.
Thank you. If that's a motion, is there a second? I'll second it. Oops, sorry, I was off. Sorry, I was off mute. I was on mute. It's been moved and seconded that we hold this item in committee. Is there any further discussion?
I'd like to know how long y'all plan to hold it in committee.
Thank you, Ms. Dickerson. Since this,
I would like for it to come back before us at our next meeting.
I would support that.
Madam Chair, just one point of clarification. Just want to make sure that Ms. Dickerson, I think mentioned, and again, I think I heard parts of her concern that related to structures that were being used as businesses, but were still being rented out, that she was having some concerns as it relates to, and talked about those being included in some form or fashion in the draft ordinance. So I'm trying to make sure that I understand that when it comes back, what it is that you all would like to see, and is that a part of what you all are asking?
Well, Madam Chair. Madam Chair,
Yes, Ms. Dickerson.
Mr. Smith and Ms. Newton, when I first brought this to the attention and Ms. Newton and I partnered on this, 50, it's about 50% residential and 50% business. My whole concern was the absentee landlord for all of the businesses. I'm telling you, most of the businesses along this corridor and a lot of corridors are creating havoc. And I just had to have Ombudsman's office go out and clean up 3 rental businesses on this corridor. So it has to be inclusive. Thank you. Businesses have to
Okay.
be inclusive.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding what changes needed to be made between now and the time it comes back. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will just add, in furtherance to Ms. Newton's question about other ordinances like this, and are they commonly done in counties? I would be curious to know of any sort of unintended consequences that may come up, so that we can try to avoid those, such as maybe evictions that would be unwanted. Okay, so we have a motion, we have a second, we have had discussion. I believe we're ready to vote. Ms. Roberts, will you call the roll for this motion?
Ratio,
Oops. Yes.
Kennedy, Manning, Jackson,
I choose to abstain, and please note the record that I did not participate in the discussion nor voting on this item because I am in fact a landlord. Thank you.
Thank you.
Newton,
Yes.
it passes.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is 4B. In the agenda, it is listed as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund request.
Madam Chair, excuse me, Bill Malinowski.
Yes, Mr. Malinowski.
Can I get a clarification on the last vote? There are 4 members present, 2 voted for the motion, and that was all. Could I get an explanation of how 2 out of 4 create the majority to pass the vote?
Mr. Smith, I will defer to you.
Well, it's a majority of those present and voting. So you had one person who indicated that he felt like he needed to recuse himself, although the committee itself is made up of 4 people. As I understand it, there are only 3 who are there or who are participating in the meeting. So it's a majority of those that are participating in the meeting and are voting.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. I didn't know the abstention took that person out of it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And to add to that, I also have an indication from Mr. Manning that he was unable to unmute himself and would like to be recorded as a yes vote.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So we will move on to the item 4B. which is, I believe, starts on page, sorry. Page 14 of our packet. And that motion reads as,
Madam Chair,
yes, Mr. Manning.
Madam Chair, this is Jim Manning. My iPhone just now said I was unmuted. So I was doing everything properly with the device I have to unmute myself, but the government muted me. I just want to be clear because you kind of made it sound like I was incapable of unmuting myself. Thank you.
I didn't mean to imply user inadequacy or anything to that effect. So
Thank you. We can move on.
Sorry. Okay, so this item before us is, I move that administration find existing budgetary funding possibilities for enactment of an affordable housing trust fund and bring all items or all options back to council for review. So that's just a little bit more expansive than only looking at a affordable housing trust fund. Is there any discussion on this matter? Yes, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Only that the next time that this appears, if we could have that motion, because on page 14 of the agenda briefing, where it says motion of origin, there is no associated council motion of origin. Let's make sure that we have that accurate, please. And in addition to that, I don't see where there was any legal review. We've got a budget and a finance review. I don't see any legal review in here. I granted that the legal department gave us discussion on it, but they're not listed there. So that and the finance, I don't think we got any real finance information, and I'd like to see that too. Thank you.
Thank
Madam
you.
Chair, may I be recognized?
Yes, Ms. Powell, please do.
I just wanted to offer to Mr. Malinowski that the briefing document that he has was prepared by legal. As such, there's no legal review.
And Ms. Powell is correct. We were the ones that were initially that drafted the briefing document itself.
Thank
So
you.
we participated in this process from that perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion on this matter?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Newton.
Thank you. And perhaps this is where you were going, but from my perspective, the motion that was read out is not fully addressed in the legal briefing that we have here. The legal briefing addresses one component of it, whereas your motion directed staff to come back and address a broad array of options for this. And so from my perspective, I would like to also hold this item in committee until our next meeting so that staff and legal can collaborate and come back with that more fulsome response to your motion.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. I see Mr. Jackson has his hand up. Ms. Newton, is that a motion at this time?
I don't want to stop Mr. Jackson from giving his comment, so let's say that it's not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Newton. I want to really actually echo and agree with what you said, Ms. Newton, without being redundant. But I want to go a little bit further and say I would really absolutely not want to, under any conditions, levy a tax increase to accomplish this. I would really strongly discourage that, and particularly considering the climate we're in now and what we're facing. And so I think unless there are legitimate alternative ways of funding it, I think it would be a very bad idea to consider at the present time any type of tax increase on the public to address this matter. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson.
Madam Chair, Jim Manning.
Yes, Mr. Manning.
And I'm sorry, I might have missed it in the documentation. Act 388, which says that a county government cannot increase taxes except for under 5 very extenuating circumstances. Were one of those 5 or 6 extenuating circumstances presented in the packet as a means of county council raising taxes to do this?
Mr. Manning, I don't believe that we have anything like that. I would like to see information from staff that would let us know a little bit more about how we can do this legally, adhering to the laws of the state of South Carolina. So thank you for bringing that up.
All righty, I move that we hold this in committee pending further information and for it to be back on next month's agenda.
Second.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I will have Ms. Roberts call for the vote to keep this item in committee for further information.
Horatio,
Yes.
Kennedy, Manning, Jackson,
Yes.
Newton, Newton.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Thank you. It passes.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I move to adjourn.
Thank you. That is, hold on, we have 5A, or we have another item on the agenda. Are you wishing to skip that, Mr. Manning?
Is it for action?
No action required.
Well, then I don't think there's any action, so yes, I'm moving for adjournment.
There's
Hey,
second.
that died of a lack of second. Keep rolling.
I believe that died for lack of second. I would like to hear information on item 5B, or sorry, 5A. I propose the change of animal care officer's official title to that of animal welfare officer within our county's ordinances. Animal care officer tends to be a bit confusing for those in the public who do not fully understand what they do. An animal control officer tends to have a derogatory connotation. The field of animal welfare / care has dramatically changed within recent years. A title of animal welfare officer offers a broader understanding of what their duties entail. That motion was submitted by Mr. Malinowski, Ms. Dickerson, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Manning, and Ms. McBride. Do we have information from staff on this item?
Madam Chair, Director Haynes of Animal Services is working on a briefing document for this item, and she does have plans to collaborate with county legal and county HR on her response.
Thank you. I look forward to learning more about that.
Madam Chair, I move to
Madam
adjourn.
Chair,
Yes, Ms. Newton.
very, very quick question. As this is a change of job title, is this something that has to be approved by council?
Madam Chair, may I be recognized?
Yes, Ms. Powell.
I believe that the intent of the motion speaks to the way that the animal care officers are referred to in ordinance, and as such would require action by council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you. The intent of the motion also is for a change in the name, and as Ms. Powell said, because it's in the ordinance, the council has to address it. But also, I would like to make sure that we're not getting ourselves into something that financially is going to cost us, because all of a sudden we find out a new title creates a new pay status. The intent of the motion when I initially made it was in order to change the title, but everything else would stay the same.
Thank you. Ms. Powell, yeah, okay, you're not in the same place on my grid that you were before. So Ms. Powell, have we checked in with HR on this matter?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am, that's a part of the collaboration I mentioned that Director Haynes will be undertaking for exactly that reason, Mr. Malinowski. We want to know first if there are any unintended consequences from a legal perspective with us changing this wording in the ordinance. And secondarily with HR, if changing this would impact anything that was done by the TRS or otherwise require us to regrade the position.
Thank you. Do we have any other discussion on this matter? Hearing none, I
Madam
will,
Chair.
yes,
I move to adjourn.
Second.
it's been moved and seconded. We will vote to adjourn. Ms. Roberts, will you call the roll?
Ratio,
Yes.
Kennedy, Manning,
No.
Jackson,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
It passes.
Thank you. I hope you all have,
Bye, everyone.
I hope the next committee is as fun as this one.